Hi, and welcome to the Christian Gamer channel. I'm Paul, and I'm using this space to share my insights from the Bible. I want to be clear right up front. I don't claim to have any special authority. I'm not a pastor, a theologian, an apostle, or anything special. I'm just an ordinary person who reads their Bible and wants to share what I've learned with the wider community. Because of that, your personal insights are absolutely no less valid than mine. I strongly urge you to join the conversation. If you disagree with anything I've said, or if you want to add something you think I've missed or glossed over, you are actively encouraged to do so. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments or even share a link to your own video. I know sharing biblical insights can be intimidating, especially in an age where simply trying to tell the truth can risk persecution or the fear of it down the road. But remember, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and self-control. So let's not be afraid to stand firm and share our faith and insights with courage. Okay, let's do this. And today I want to continue the talk on Can We Trust the Bible? And in this one it's part 2, in which case we look at the Old Testament. In part 1 of Can We Trust the Bible, I talked about the overwhelming number of manuscripts attesting to the New Testament and the huge number of textual variations, providing a plethora of clues to help textual critics reconstruct the original texts. In this video I want to look at the Old Testament and consider the evidence for its authenticity despite it being significantly older with far fewer ancient manuscripts. Now the total Hebrew manuscripts and fragments are around 6,000 to 10,000, which is an awful lot less than the New Testament numbers that were in the hundreds of thousands. And pre-1000 AD, there are relatively few complete Hebrew manuscripts from this era because Jewish scribes would often ritually bury or destroy worn-out copies to prevent desecration. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls is the most famous ancient textual witnesses, of which there are 39 fragments from Psalms, 33 from Deuteronomy, 22 from Isaiah, including the famous Great Isaiah Scroll, 20 from Genesis, 18 from Exodus, and 17 from Leviticus. Now, if we define ancient as anything before the Middle Ages or pre-500 AD, the number of primary textual witnesses is roughly 230 Hebrew manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, several dozen Greek papyri from the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch as separate witness for the first 5 books, the Nash Papyrus, a single fragment from around 150 before Christ, containing the 10 Commandments. So in total, while we have thousands of fragments from later centuries, we have roughly 250 to 300 distinct ancient manuscript witnesses produced before the end of the 1st century AD. So can we still be sure? Despite the relative sparsity of manuscript witnesses, there are some compelling reasons why we can trust the accurate transmission of the texts. The preservation of the Old Testament is often cited by scholars as one of the most rigorous examples of manuscript transmission in history. The level of care was not just professional, it was a deeply religious ritual involving extreme checks and balances. So the Scribal Code of Conduct. For centuries, Jewish scribes, particularly the Sopherim or early scribes, and the later Masoretes, that's around 500 to 1000 of the Common Era or AD, followed a strict set of rules to ensure 0 errors. According to the Talmud and later Masoretic traditions, a scribe could be disqualified for the smallest infraction. So the rules of accuracy So no memory work. A scribe was strictly forbidden from writing even a single letter from memory. They had to look at an authenticated master manuscript, verbalize the word aloud, and then write it. The one letter rule. Every letter had to have a hairbreadth of white space around it. If two letters touched, the entire page, or sometimes the entire scroll, was considered pasul or invalid. The 30-day audit. Once a scroll was finished, it had to be checked by an editor within 30 days. If 3 or more mistakes were found on a single page, the entire manuscript had to be buried or destroyed. It could not be fixed. Divine reverence. Before writing the name of God, a scribe had to wipe their pen and, in some traditions, perform a ritual bath or mikveh. If a king addressed them while they were writing God's name, they were commanded to ignore him until the name was finished. And then the statistical verification. So the word Sopherim actually comes from the Hebrew root meaning to count. To verify the accuracy of a copy, the Masoretes developed a system of statistical fingerprints for every book of the Bible. For example, a letter count. Scribes knew exactly how many times each letter of the alphabet appeared in each book. A middle point. They identified the middle letter and middle word of the entire Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. If the middle letter of the new copy didn't match the master, the copy was rejected. And verse totals. Each book had a specific verse total that had to be tallied at the end of the transcription. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The most famous fact check for this process occurred in 1947 with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before this find, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible was the Leningrad Codex, dating to 1008 of the Common Era, or 1008 AD. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain manuscripts from roughly 100 before the Common Era, or 100 before Christ. This created a 1,100-year gap where critics assumed the text must have changed significantly. However, when the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls was compared to the Masoretic text from 1,000 years later, they were 95% identical. So the difference is that 5% variation consisted almost entirely of minor spelling shifts, similar to honour versus honour with the U, the majority of which are where consonants were used as vowels to aid pronunciation instead of the pointed Hebrew used by the Masoretes. It's called the Mater's Lectionis. In fact, we looked at that during the Advent study. And slips of the pen that did not significantly change the meaning of the text. The main exceptions, where changes were significant, will be addressed later in this presentation. So why are there no originals? One irony of this extreme care is that it explains why we don't have the original autographs. That's the very first scrolls written by Moses or David. Because the Jews viewed the scrolls as the literal word of God. A worn-out or damaged scroll was seen as desecration. Instead of keeping old tattered originals, they would ceremonially bury them in a Geniza or Geniza, a hiding place or storage room, to prevent them from being mistreated. This ensured the text survived, but the physical paper was recycled or returned to the earth. The general idea is that once the pages start to get worn out, the text can become difficult to read, and that can increase the risk of errors creeping in. So rather than having old worn out copies, fresh new copies from easily legible manuscripts are regularly made to reduce the number of errors that could be transmitted. And then there's the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is a collection of approximately 400,000 manuscript fragments, not necessarily all from the Old Testament, found in Geniza. That's a storeroom of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, or Old Cairo in Egypt. While local Jewish leaders and some travellers knew of the storeroom's existence for centuries, its significance was discovered by the Western academic world in stages. Now, initial awareness in the mid-1800s, travellers like Jacob Saphir described the Geniza in the 1860s, and various collectors began buying fragments from the synagogue. The official academic discovery in 1896. The most famous breakthrough occurred when twin sisters Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson showed a fragment they had brought in Egypt to Solomon Schechter, a scholar at Cambridge University. Schechter immediately recognised it as a rare piece of the original Hebrew text of the Book of Sirach. Now, the Great Recovery in 1897, Schechter travelled to Cairo in late 1896 and, with the permission of the chief rabbi, cleared out the Geniza in 1897, shipping the vast majority of the fragments to Cambridge. Now, the fragments do not all date from the same period, rather they represent a continuous dump of documents over a millennium. The primary range. The bulk of the documents date from the 9th to the 13th centuries of the Common Era. Now, the oldest fragments, some of the oldest literary fragments date back to the 6th or 8th centuries of the Common Era. And the latest documents, because the synagogue remained active, some documents in the collection date as late as the 19th century, just before Schechter's arrival. Now, agreement with the Masoretic text. The Cairo Geniza is a crucial bridge in the history of the Bible. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Geniza provided the oldest evidence of how the Hebrew Bible was developing. The biblical fragments from the Cairo Geniza show a very high degree of agreement with the standard Masoretic text we use today. This confirms that the Masoretic Scribes, like the Ben Asher family, who lived in Tiberias around the same time as many of the scrolls were produced, were extremely successful in standardizing the text. One of the most important aspects of the Geniza was not just the words but the vowel points. The Geniza contained text with Palestinian and Babylonian vocalization systems, which were different from the Tiberian system, the one that eventually won and became the standard Masoretic text. While the consonants, thus the letters, were largely the same, the Geniza showed that before the 10th century there was still some slight variety in how words were pronounced or accented across different Jewish communities. And why is this so important? The Cairo Geniza proved that the Masoretic text wasn't just a late invention, but was the result of a long, careful process of preservation. It provided the missing link between the Dead Sea Scrolls, or 100 before the Common Era, and the oldest complete Bibles like the Leningrad Codex, 1008 of the Common Era, showing that the text had remained incredibly stable through the Middle Ages. And that brings us on to the Septuagint. The Septuagint, commonly abbreviated to the Roman numeral for 70, or LXX, is the most influential translation of the Hebrew Bible in history. It was the Bible of the early church, and is the primary reason the Old Testament is part of the Christian canon today. Okay, so the origins of the Septuagint, we're comparing the fact versus the legend. The history of the Septuagint is a mix of famous religious legend and a more gradual historical reality. Okay, so the legend relates to the letter of Aristeas. According to a 2nd century before the Common Era document called the Letter of Aristeas, the Egyptian king Ptolemy II Philadelphus 285 to 246 before the Common Era wanted a copy of the Jewish law for the Great Library of Alexandria. He requested 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, to come to Egypt. They were placed on the island of Pharos. You might even remember the Pharos lighthouse. And according to later versions of the story, Philo and Justin Martyr, they were put in separate cells. Miraculously, after 72 days, all 72 translators emerged with identical Greek translations, proving the work was divinely inspired. And the historical reality: modern scholars believe the truth is more practical. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, a massive Jewish population lived in Alexandria. Many had forgotten Hebrew and spoke Koine Greek. They needed the scriptures in their own tongue for synagogue worship. The Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy, was translated first, around 250 before the Common Era. The rest of the books, the prophets and writings, were translated piecemeal over the next 150 years, likely finishing around 130 before the Common Era. Because it was done by different people at different times, the quality varies. Some books, like the Torah, are very literal, while others, like Daniel or Job, are more like paraphrases. Now, the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text. You might wonder why we have 2 versions of the Old Testament. The Septuagint represents a different snapshot of the Hebrew text than the one the Masoretes standardized 1,000 years later. So the Masoretic text is in Hebrew. The oldest manuscript is between 900 and 1000 of the Common Era. That's the Leningrad Codex. The order of the books is Law, Prophets and Writings, and it's standard length. It's basically what we see in our normal Protestant Old Testaments. Now, the Septuagint, the language was Koine Greek. The dating was roughly 350 of the Common Era for the oldest manuscript, and that's the Codex Vaticanus, or the Vatican Codex. The book order is Law, History, Poetry, Prophets, and the length is generally longer, and it includes the Apocrypha, and it's generally the main Old Testament that you will see in Catholic Bibles, such as the Jerusalem Bible. Now, key differences. Aside from the difference in Isaiah 7:14, which we looked at in our Advent study, there are some noteworthy differences in the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, the Septuagint is about 13% shorter and has a different chapter order than the Hebrew version we use today. The missing material in the Septuagint consists of mainly small details such as repeated titles like the prophet after Jeremiah's name, individual words, and even entire verses and paragraphs found in the Masoretic text. So where there are repeated words or titles, the Septuagint tends to take them out, and the Hebrew version we use today tends to leave them in. A major structural difference is the placement of the oracles against the nations, or the prophecies against Egypt, Philistia, Moab, etc. In the Masoretic text, these appear at the end of the book, chapters 46 to 51. In the Septuagint, they are placed in the middle of the book, immediately following Jeremiah 25:13. Now, evidence from the primary material, that is to say the Dead Sea Scrolls. For centuries, scholars debated whether the Greek translators had simply edited down the Hebrew, or if they were translating a different, shorter Hebrew version. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran provided the smoking gun evidence. 4 Qumran Jeremiah B and 4 Qumran Jeremiah D. These specific Hebrew fragments found at Qumran, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, match the shorter Septuagint version in both length and chapter order, whereas 4 Qumran Jeremiah A and 4 Qumran Jeremiah C, the other fragments from the same caves, match the longer Masoretic version. This confirms that two distinct Hebrew versions of Jeremiah, one shorter and one longer, existed simultaneously in antiquity. The Septuagint was not a bad translation, but rather an accurate translation of an older, shorter Hebrew tradition that was later expanded upon to create what eventually became the Masoretic text. The divine name. In many, but not all, places where the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text use the divine name or a divine name substitute, the Septuagint tends to translate the different words for the divine name as Kyrios or Lord. In Exodus 3:14-15, the Hebrew Aya Asher Aya, often translated as I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. The Septuagint translates this as ego emai ho own, and the translation I am the being, or I am the one who is. And a grammar note here, ho own is the present participle of the Greek verb to be, which is emai. By using the definite article ho, the translators turned a verb into a title, emphasizing God's eternal, self-existent nature. And in Exodus 3:15, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH or YHVH, or Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, immediately following the I am statement, God provides his memorial name, the Tetragrammaton. While the modern Bibles transliterate this as Yahweh or Jehovah, the Septuagint almost universally renders it as Kyrios, meaning Lord. In the specific context of verse 15, the Septuagint says, Kyrios ho theos ton pateron humon, and the translation is, the Lord, the God of your fathers. And why the Septuagint matters to Christians. If you read the New Testament quotations from the Old Testament, you're essentially reading the Septuagint. Apostolic quotations. About 80% to 90% of the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament are taken directly from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. And the virgin prophecy. A famous example is Isaiah 7:14. The Hebrew word alma can mean young woman or virgin, but the Septuagint chose the specific Greek word parthenos, which exclusively means virgin. For obvious reasons, this Greek translation became the primary proof text for the fulfilled prophecy concerning Jesus' birth. And the canon split. Early Christians used the Septuagint, which included books like Tobit, Judith, and Maccabees. When Protestant reformers like Martin Luther decided to go back to the original, they rejected the Septuagint's extra books in favour of the shorter Hebrew canon preserved by the Jewish community. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually contain fragments of Hebrew texts that match the Septuagint better than they match the Masoretic text, proving that the Septuagint wasn't just bad translating, it was often based on very old, valid Hebrew tradition that was later lost or edited. Now, our English translations, starting with the King James Version, most Protestant Bibles follow the text of the Masoretic text because the Protestant reformers believed the Hebrew text was more authentic than the Greek text. In the King James Version, there were a few notable exceptions. Psalm 22:16, The Masoretic Hebrew reads, "Like a lion, my hands and feet," which is difficult to parse. The King James Version follows a Septuagint or Vulgate reading, "They pierced my hands and my feet." And Isaiah 7:14, the King James Version uses the word virgin, which matches the Greek parthenos in the Septuagint. The Hebrew word alma is more general, young woman, though the King James Version translators viewed the Greek as the correct interpretive lens for the prophecy. And the Apocrypha. The original 1611 King James Version actually included the Apocrypha, books like Tobit and Maccabees. Since these books do not exist in the Masoretic Hebrew Canon, the King James Version translators used the Septuagint as their primary source for that specific section. Now, the King James Version translators used the Ben Chaim Masoretic text as their primary anchor. When the Hebrew was particularly obscure, they consulted the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and earlier English versions, like the Bishop's Bible, to find the best rendering, but they rarely departed from the Hebrew structure. Modern translations, like the New International Version and English Standard Version, still use the Masoretic text as their primary foundation, but they are much more willing to incorporate the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls than the King James Version was. This approach is known as eclecticism. Rather than sticking strictly to one manuscript tradition, modern scholars look at all available ancient witnesses to determine the most likely original reading. And let's compare the New International Version and the English Standard Version. Both, as the primary Old Testament text, use the good old Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia. That's the critical edition that translators use for the Old Testament these days. And the philosophy, the New International Version, is a dynamic equivalence version, and it focuses on thought-for-thought clarity, whereas the English Standard Version is a formal equivalence, which focuses on word-for-word literalness. Now, the Septuagint usage. The New International Version frequently uses the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls to smooth out difficult Hebrew passages for readability, and the English Standard Version uses the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls primarily when the Hebrew is broken or clearly corrupted. Now, the footnotes for the NIV are extensive, regularly noting when they depart from the Masoretic text to follow the Septuagint. And the English Standard Version, the footnotes are moderate. Usually notes compare Septuagint when a variant is used. Now, key examples of choosing the Septuagint. In several famous passages, both the NIV and English Standard Version choose the Septuagint or Dead Sea Scrolls over the Masoretic text because the older Greek scroll versions seem to preserve a more logical or original thought. Deuteronomy 32:8, the sons of God. The Masoretic text, the King James Version, God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. The Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls, used by the NIV and the English Standard Version, God divided the nations according to the numbers of the sons of God, or heavenly court. And the result, most modern Bibles, including the English Standard Version, now follow the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls reading here, as it makes more sense in the context of ancient Near Eastern theology. Psalm 145, 13b, the missing verse. Psalm 145 is an acrostic poem. Each verse starts with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In the Masoretic text, the verse for the letter Nun is missing. And the Masoretic text in the King James Version simply skips the letter Nun, whereas the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls in the NIV and English Standard Version includes the verse, The Lord is faithful in all his words, and kind in all his works. Both the NIV and the ESV have an explanatory footnote about this. The result is modern Bibles reinsert this verse from the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls to restore the poem's structure. 1 Samuel 14:41, the Urim and Thummim. The King James Version follows the Masoretic text. Saul says, "Give a perfect lot," which is very short. Now the NIV and ESV follow the Septuagint. Saul says a much longer prayer asking God to reveal the truth through the Urim and Thummim. The NIV and ESV include the longer prayer from the Greek, noting that the Hebrew text likely suffered a scribal skip, or homeoteluton, meaning the same ending, where a scribe's eye jumped from one line to another due to a similar looking word or phrase. So why the shift? Modern Bibles have a Masoretic priority, but they don't have Masoretic exclusivity, because we now have the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947. We know that the Septuagint was often translated from a different version of the Hebrew that was older than the one the Masoretes finalized 1,000 years later. Now, Catholic Bibles. Catholic Bibles, for example the Nova Vulgata or New Vulgate, Douay Rheims Bible, Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, New American Bible and the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, unlike the Protestant Bibles, tend to rely on a unique blend of three major manuscript traditions. Unlike the Protestant canon, which relies almost exclusively on the Masoretic text, the Catholic tradition also draws heavily from the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. Now, the Septuagint, the theological foundation. The Catholic Church views the Septuagint as its own from the very beginning, because the Apostles and the New Testament writers quoted primarily from the Greek Septuagint. The Catholic Church used it to determine which books belong in the Bible. This is why Catholic Bibles include Deuterocanon, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and 1 and 2 Maccabees, as well as additions to Daniel and Esther. These books were written in the Greek Septuagint used by the early church, but were not in the later standardized Hebrew Masoretic Bible. And the Greek heritage. For the first 400 years of Christianity, the Septuagint was the primary Old Testament for all Christians. Now, turning to additions to Daniel, the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. The book of Daniel and Esther are significantly longer than they are in the Protestant or Jewish canons. This is because the Catholic Bibles follows the Septuagint tradition, which contains several additions that were not preserved in the Hebrew Masoretic text. Now, the additions to Daniel. In the Protestant Bible, Daniel has 12 chapters. In the Catholic Bible, it includes 3 major sections that add a more liturgical and detective-like feel to the book. The Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children. This is inserted right into the middle of the fiery furnace story in Daniel 3. It includes a beautiful hymn of praise that is still used today in Catholic and Anglican liturgy. And Susanna. This is a famous story of a virtuous woman falsely accused of adultery by 2 corrupt elders. Daniel acts as a detective, cross-examining the elders separately to prove their stories don't match, thereby saving Susanna's life. Bel and the Dragon. This consists of 2 shorter stories where Daniel mocks Babylonian idolatry. He uses logic and forensics, like spreading ashes on the floor to catch the priest's footprint, to prove that the idol Bel doesn't actually eat food offered to it. He also makes I think it's like a small bomb which he tosses into the mouth of the idol of the dragon, and it kind of explodes, revealing what the idol is actually made of. Now, the additions to Esther are fascinating because they change the entire tone of the book. The God problem. The Hebrew version of Esther is famous for never mentioning God. It reads like a secular political thriller. And the Greek solution, the 6 editions in the Greek Septuagint, labelled A through F, fix this by adding prayers from Esther and Mordecai, dreams and visions from God, and explicit mentions of God's providence. And the placement. In Catholic Bibles, these additions are usually woven into the narrative at the appropriate points. However, in some older versions, like the original Douay-Rheims, they were sometimes tucked at the end of the book, which can make the timeline a bit confusing to read. Now, fact-checking the additions. Why did Protestants remove these, and what does history say about them? Now, the language of origin. For a long time, scholars believed these additions were written originally in Greek by Alexandrian Jews. This was the primary reason Jerome and later Luther doubted them. Now, Semitic origins. Recent scholarship on Susanna and the prayer of Azariah suggests they may have been based on original Hebrew or Aramaic texts that were lost. Fragments of similar stories have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, though not the exact text of the editions themselves. And theological use. The early church fathers like Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria quoted these additions as scripture without distinction. The split really only became permanent during the Reformation, when the Hebrew Verity, the 39 book list, was prioritized over the Greek tradition. Now, do any of these change the theology? None of these additions significantly change the core message of the Old Testament or could be used to justify introducing any new doctrine. The additions to Daniel, liturgy and moral examples. The 3 additions to Daniel, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, and the Song of the 3 Holy Children, are used more for liturgy and moral instruction than for establishing unique dogmas. The Song of the 3 Holy Children. This is the most important addition theologically. It contains the Benedictite, a beautiful hymn calling all creation to bless the Lord. And the usage. It is a staple in the Catholic liturgy of the hours or morning prayer. And theology. It reinforces the sacramental worldview that the physical world, sun, moon, stars, animals, reveals God's glory. However, this theology is already found in the shared 39 books, for example Psalm 19 and Psalm 148. Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. These are treated as wisdom stories. They emphasize God's protection of the innocent and the folly of idolatry. And theology, they don't introduce new laws or dogmas, they simply provide more data points for Daniel's wisdom and faithfulness. And the additions to Esther, the divine providence. As mentioned earlier, the Greek additions to Esther mainly serve to make the hidden God of the Hebrew version explicit. Theology of prayer. The additions include long, humble prayers by Esther and Mordecai. While these are beautiful examples of Catholic petitionary prayer, the concept of praying for God's help in times of national crisis is already ubiquitous in the shared Protestant Catholic canon, such as Nehemiah or the Psalms. The result, if you remove the additions as Protestants do, the theology doesn't change. The hiddenness of God in the Hebrew version is simply seen as a literary device to show that God works behind the scenes. Catholics simply prefer the version where the work is made overt. Now, Septuagint books that can be used to justify a different doctrine. To give you a complete picture, it's helpful to see where the Catholic extra books, the Deuterocanon, do support exclusive doctrines. 2 Maccabees 12, Purgatory or Prayer for the Dead, describes a sacrifice offering for the sins of the dead. This is the primary proof text for purgatory. And Tobit 12, Intercession of Angels, describes the Archangel Raphael presenting Tobit's prayer to God, which supports the intercession of saints and angels. And Sirach 3, Almsgiving for Atonement, says that alms atone for sins. This was a major point of contention during the Reformation, faith versus works. However, Catholics can still justify those doctrines without the Apocrypha. While those verses provide the strongest justification for the doctrines of purgatory, intercession, and alms for forgiveness, these doctrines can be justified by Catholics without having to appeal to those verses. Purgatory. Those who believe in purgatory can also see the idea of purgatory in 1 Corinthians 3, 12-15 and 1 Corinthians 15, 29, though Catholics don't practice baptism for the dead, but use the passage to show that the principle that the fate of the dead can be influenced by the living, for example, by saying prayers for the dead. Furthermore, Matthew 12:32 says a certain sin will not be forgiven in this age or in the age to come, suggesting some sins can be forgiven in the age to come. And intercession, the idea of angels presenting prayers as offerings before God, can also be seen in the book of Revelation, Revelation 8 verses 3-4. And alms for forgiveness, the idea that righteous acts, especially kindness to the poor, can cover over sins, can be found in passages like Daniel 4:27, Luke 11:41, and 1 Peter 4:8. Likewise, these doctrines can be refuted even with the Apocrypha. So 2 Maccabees and the prayer for the dead, the passage, 2 Maccabees 12:39-45, Judas Maccabeus finds idols on the bodies of fallen Jewish soldiers. He collects money to send to Jerusalem for a sin offering for the deceased. And the refutation or alternative view, the sin of idolatry problem. The soldiers died while committing the sin of idolatry, wearing pagan amulets. In the standard Catholic theology, dying in a state of mortal sin leads to hell, not purgatory. Therefore, if they were in hell, the prayer wouldn't help anyway. And resurrection, not purgatory. A careful reading of the text shows the author's focus is on the general resurrection, not an intermediate state. The text says Judas did this taking account of the resurrection. The argument can be made that he was concerned about their standing at the end of time, not their current suffering in a purging fire. And the author's opinion, the author of 2 Maccabees adds a personal commentary at the end of the book, that's 2 Maccabees 15:37-38, admitting his work may be imperfect or mediocre. Reformers like Luther argued that a book where the author admits he might be failing shouldn't be used to establish infallible dogma. Now, Sirach and alms for atonement. The passage, Sirach 3:30, as water quenches a blazing fire, so almsgiving atones for sin. And the refutation or alternative view, this is hyperbolic wisdom literature. Sirach is wisdom literature, like Proverbs. This genre often uses hyperbole to stress a point, just as Proverbs 10:2 says, righteousness delivers from death. No one interprets that to mean a good person will never die physically. The passage can be read as a poetic way of saying that charity is a sign of a heart that is right with God, rather than a literal transaction for sin. And the covering versus cleansing. In Jewish context, atonement, kippur, often means a covering or a restoration of communal ritual purity, not necessarily the eternal salvation of the soul, which was always based on God's covenant mercy. Tobit and the intercession of angels. And the passage, Tobit 12:12 and Tobit 12:15, the angel Raphael says, I brought a reminder of your prayer before the Holy One. I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready to enter before the glory of the Lord. The refutation or alternative view, it's a literary device. Tobit is often classified by modern scholars, including many Catholic ones, as a religious novel or folk tale. If the book is intended as an edifying story rather than a historical record, using the specific actions of Raphael to build a theology of angelic mediation is problematic. And the one mediator argument, critics point to 1 Timothy 2:5, for there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus. They argue that any interpretation of Tobit that makes an angel a necessary bridge for prayer contradicts the clear teaching of the New Testament. So in summary, the most common way to interpret these passages without endorsing the doctrine is to view them through the lens of Second Temple Jewish culture. In this view, the prayer for the dead in Maccabees wasn't a settled doctrine, but a spontaneous gesture of hope in the resurrection. Alms for atoning for sin was a metaphor for the importance of social justice. By treating these books as historical or devotional rather than doctrinal or canonical, the pressure to find dogma in them disappears. And conclusion on the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. While these books have been used by Catholics to justify exclusive Catholic doctrines, and those doctrines are easier to justify with those books and harder to refute, they can still be refuted by those who already accept these books as canonical. Furthermore, if these books were not in the Bible, Catholics could still justify their doctrines even without those books. It would just be a little harder. Lastly, since the New Testament clearly teaches that the Old Covenant has passed away, trying to justify a teaching in the New Testament Church exclusively using verses from the Old Testament is problematic in and of itself. So whether we accept the additional books of the Old Testament recorded in the Septuagint or reject them is doctrinally neither here nor there. Now, the Latin Vulgate, the official reference, in the late 4th century, St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. This version, the Vulgate, became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church for over 1,500 years. Jerome actually preferred the Hebrew Verity, or Hebraica Veritas, as translated from the Old Testament, directly from Hebrew manuscripts available to him at the time, which closely resembled the Masoretic text. However, because the Church was so used to the Septuagint, Jerome was pressured to include the Deuterocanonical books, which he initially doubted, to match the traditional list. Now, the Council of Trent in 1546, the Church officially declared the Vulgate the authentic and authoritative Latin edition, partly to stabilise the text against the new variations appearing during the Reformation. Our modern Catholic Bibles, the eclectic approach. If you pick up a modern Catholic Bible today, like the New American Bible or the Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, the translators do not just translate the Latin Vulgate, instead they use a critical or eclectic method. Now, the base, they use the Masoretic text in Hebrew as the primary base for the 39 books shared with Protestants. And the Greek supplement, they use the Septuagint for the 7 Deuterocanonical books, since no Hebrew copies of them existed until recently. and the corrections. If a passage in the Hebrew Masoretic text is confusing or seems corrupted, Catholic translators are often more willing than Protestants to look at the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls to find an older reading that makes more sense. So Catholic versus Protestant translations. Now, the primary text is the Masoretic text for both. The secondary text, Protestant Bibles rarely use the Septuagint, whereas the Catholic churches regularly use Septuagint and Vulgate. The number of books in the Protestant Bible is 39, in the Old Testament that is, and the Catholic Bible has 46 books in the Old Testament. Now, the historical anchor for Protestant Bibles is the Hebrew tradition, and for Catholic Bibles it's the Greek and Latin tradition. So, summary and conclusion, a testament to integrity. The scribe's devotion. The preservation of the Old Testament was not merely a task, but a sacred ritual. Scribes like the Masoretes employed rigorous statistical checks, counting every letter and identifying middle words to ensure that not a single stroke was lost to history. And a unified tradition. Despite thousands of years and diverse languages, the level of agreement between different traditions is staggering. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that the Hebrew text remained 95% identical over a millennium, with lost variations being simple spelling shifts. Integrity and diversity. Whether looking at the Hebrew Masoretic text, the Greek Septuagint, or the findings at Qumran, we see a consistent core message. Modern translations, like the NIV and the English Standard Version and Catholic editions, utilize these different snapshots to bring us closer to the original autographs than ever before. Now, the lesson here. This is my lesson I want to emphasize. If you have different lessons, please put them in the comments, because I would really love to hear from you. So the lesson here is great care and integrity. For centuries, scribes treated every letter with profound reverence, viewing themselves as stewards of a divine message. They didn't just copy words, they laboured to preserve truth. We are the beneficiaries of that labour. The question for us today is, are we as intentional in our listening as they were in their writing? When we encounter a difficult passage, we have the opportunity to move past the quick hit and join the scribal tradition, studying prayerfully, comparing versions, and allowing the text to shape our thoughts rather than shaping the text to fit our own. And a call to action. I encourage you to compare different versions of the Bible, such as a Masoretic-based Protestant version and a Septuagint-informed Catholic version. See for yourself the remarkable harmony that exists despite the centuries of transmission. The evidence is clear. The word has been kept with unparalleled honesty and care. Let me know in the comments what versions of the Bible you have read and which are your favourites and why. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson and I hope it was useful. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It helps a small channel immensely. And I will look forward to seeing you in next week's video.